morning. Single 2 Bridgenalls, please.
£3.50, please. 5 times 10.
Thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye now.
Not many years ago, it was the dream of just about every schoolboy to drive an express steam locomotive like this. In the days before jet aircraft and space travel broke new frontiers, the express driver was the hero of his day, earning the sort of respect and admiration given today to astronauts, or possibly the pilot of Concorde. He could carry more people at a faster speed than any other means of transport. Glamorous express names like the Royal Scot, the Golden Arrow, the Cornish Riviera Express, and the Silver Jubilee added much mystique.
British Railways' last steam locomotives ran in August 1968, but steam is still very much alive at places like the Severn Valley Railway and other private railways, museums and steam centres. There are about 100 places around Britain where you can still see standard gauge steam locomotives, either on display or at work. The express passenger locomotive has always been the centre of attention, and no wonder, for the express train running at speed is an awesome spectacle. The billowing exhaust, the shrieking whistle, and the exhilarating shaking of the earth as the train roars past remain as exciting today as they have always been. The steam engine was invented in Britain, and around 500 standard gauge mainline locomotives are in the care of today's preservationists. Some date from the earliest days, whilst others are from the last years of steam construction in the 1950s. So join me now for a fascinating journey, starting in 1830.
Well, I bought my ticket. The guard is just about ready, so I better find my seat. There's something especially British about steam trains. The rhythm of the wheels, the cosy comfort of a compartment, especially if you can get one to yourself, and the clouds of steam drifting past the window all add to the unique atmosphere. But it wasn't always as comfortable as this. For passengers were never as important in the early railways as goods traffic, certainly in terms of income. The first successful public railway, the Stockton and Darlington Railway, opened in 1825 for carrying coal. But it was another 5 years before the first passenger line, relying entirely on locomotives, opened, linking Liverpool with Manchester on September the 15th, 1830. Stephenson's legendary rocket was at work on that momentous day. And it is with this historic locomotive that our journey really begins. It wasn't the first to run on rails by any means, but it was the world's first successful passenger locomotive.
Owned by the National Railway Museum, this working reproduction of Rocket was built to commemorate the 150th anniversary in 1980 of the opening of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. The stagecoach ancestry of its first-class carriages is clearly apparent. Rocket is shown as first built, with steeply inclined cylinders. On the original locomotive, displayed today at the Science Museum in London, these were later lowered to a nearly horizontal position. With railways firmly established by 1830 as a reliable form of transport, there was increasing demand for heavier, faster trains, and the early locomotives became inadequate. In 1833, Robert Stephenson produced Patent T, which established the outline of subsequent British locomotives. After this, they became taller, longer, heavier, and more powerful, but they followed the general layout established by Patent T. Sadly, few locomotives survive from this period. However, a close descendant of Patent T is the venerable Lion, built in 1838 as Liverpool and Manchester Railway number 57. Lion was sold to the Mersey Docks and Harbour Board in 1859 and was subsequently used to drive a pump. Happily, the locomotive survived to be rediscovered and preserved by the LMS in 1923. Lion is probably best known for its performance as the Titfield Thunderbolt in the 1953 Ealing comedy. As locomotives grew in size and power, engineers faced new difficulties. Patent T types like Lion needed a crank axle, which was troublesome to manufacture and an obvious source of mechanical weakness. In 1845, the Grand Junction Railway at Crewe built Columbine with outsized cylinders and needing no crank axle. The first example of the Crewe type, Columbine pointed the way forward for the next 40 years. Large wheels, like those of the Crewe type Cornwall, were popular for high-speed running because they minimized the speed at which the pistons had to work in the cylinders. A large wheel running at 50 miles per hour turned more slowly than a small wheel running at the same speed, and this was important in these days of rather primitive lubrication. Cornwall was introduced in 1847 and then rebuilt in its present form by John Ramsbottom, who took over as locomotive superintendent at Crewe in 1857. Another fine locomotive owned by the National Railway Museum is Midland Railway number 158A, built in 1866. Fitted with 4 coupled driving wheels and capable of very hard work, the class of 29 engines was rebuilt twice in subsequent years. Number 158A was not withdrawn until 1948, after 82 years at work. It is painted in the Midland's famous crimson livery. Until 1883, the company had painted its locomotives green, a popular choice, for it was believed that green had the least harmful effect on the human eye. In 1870, the Great Northern Railway unveiled the graceful single-wheeler, designed by Patrick Stirling. By the 1880s, the class was in command of the fastest trains in the world. Number 1 was withdrawn and preserved in 1907 after running nearly 1.5 million miles. But its story was far from over. In 1938, it was restored to working order to help promote the LNER's new Flying Scotsman train before being shunted back into York Railway Museum. In 1975, Number 1 took its place in the new National Railway Museum, also at York. In 1882, the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway produced Gladstone, designed by William Stroudley. This was an unusual locomotive, for other engineers did not like large diameter leading driving wheels. They preferred to add small leading wheels to steady the ride and guide the locomotive safely and smoothly into points, curves and crossings. Even so, Gladstone and its 35 classmates were highly successful. The Great Western Railway had been engineered by Isambard Kingdom Brunel, the flamboyant genius who described the GWR, not immodestly, as the greatest work in England. His railway was built to the broad gauge of 7 feet and 1/4 inch, Brunel dismissing the standard gauge of 4 feet 8½ inches as the coal cart gauge. This working reproduction of 1847 single Iron Duke was unveiled in 1985, the 150th birthday of the GWR. Brunel's unique broad gauge was doomed to extinction, and the last train ran in 1892. The redundant locomotives filled the sidings at Swindon Works, awaiting scrapping.
Following the railway mania of the mid-19th century, when railways were built to serve every corner of the kingdom, or so it seemed, timing had become crucial. Competition was fierce between companies whose routes served similar destinations, and the trains which ran punctually and got there faster won the business. In 1888, and again in 1895, the renowned Races to the North took place, in which the Great Northern Railway and its partners on the East Coast Main Line from King's Cross competed with the London and North Western Railway and its West Coast Main Line partners operating from Euston. They were fighting for the prestigious Anglo-Scottish Express traffic. In 1888, the destination was Edinburgh. In 1895, Aberdeen. It was a spectacular period.
This is the Glasgow Museum of Transport, home of Caledonian Railway single number 123. This locomotive was used in the races of 1888, which were triggered by the Great Northern Railway's decision to allow third-class travel on the 10 o'clock train from King's Cross, with a booked journey time of 9 hours. The West Coast companies matched this service, and cut followed cut, until both companies were advertising a 7¼ hour service for the journey of nearly 393 miles. Slow by today's standards, certainly, but breathtaking for an era in which road travel was still the domain of the horse. During the races of 1888, number 123 averaged 60 miles per hour between Carlisle and Edinburgh, which included the difficult climb to Beatwick Summit. It was finally withdrawn in 1935 and preserved. In 1958, number 123 was returned to service for a brief spell of rail tour duty before being handed over to the Glasgow Museum of Transport. The opening of the Forth Bridge in 1890 shortened the East Coast route to Aberdeen, giving a 15-minute advantage over West Coast services, and this paved the way for the races of 1895. Competition was sharp, common sense was apparently forgotten, and the Aberdeen services rapidly evolved into a hammer-and-tong sprint with token lightweight trains. In 1895, Hardwick, then just 3 years old, achieved an average speed of 67.2 miles per hour on the steeply graded main line from Crewe to Carlisle. This was a startling achievement for the day. Whilst the racing ended in late summer 1895, the very fast running continued, and within a year, tragedy followed. In July 1896, a West Coast Scottish Express hauled by 2 engines was wrecked while speeding through Preston. With the exception of the last carriage, the whole train was destroyed. Fortunately, there was only a single fatality. Even so, as a result, express timings were restricted for more than 30 years. In 1899, the Midland Railway built its last single-wheelers, similar to number 673 here at the National Railway Museum. But the day of the single was over, certainly for express duties. The inside cylinder 440 had become the classic British locomotive by 1900, and within 20 years it was the most common type in the country. This is North Eastern Railway number 1621, built in 1893 for express service. Another of the National Railway Museum's 440s is this London and South Western Railway class T9, painted in British Railways black livery at work on the Watercress line in Hampshire. Introduced in 1899, the T9s were known as greyhounds because of their sleek lines and fast running. More than 80 examples shouldered the burden of South Western Express passenger services from London until after the First World War. They had a very long and useful life and could still be seen at work on secondary passenger trains in 1961, their last year of BR service, when they were more than 60 years old. In 1898, the Great Northern Railway produced number 990, later named Henry Oakley, after the company's general manager. It was a completely new type of locomotive in this country and became known as the Atlantic, because this wheel arrangement had originated on America's Atlantic City Railroad. In 1902, the design was enlarged, but the Atlantic's period of preeminence was brief. In the 19th century, engineers had responded to increasing traffic demands simply by enlarging previous designs. There had been no significant advance in the ways in which steam was created and used, and the Atlantics were the last stage in this phase of development. This is Pioneer Midland Compound number 2631, built in 1902. It was later rebuilt and became number 1000. Compound locomotives use steam twice, once at high pressure and then again at a lower pressure in a second cylinder. The Compound was the Midland's largest express engine, and 240 examples were eventually built. They were capable locomotives, but compound working was not taken up by other companies, and this class was effectively an offshoot from the mainstream of British locomotive development in the 20th century. For the next major thrust of development, we must turn to the Great Western Railway, where the legendary George Jackson Churchward was appointed as Chief Mechanical Engineer in 1902. In his first year of office, Churchward produced the City class, and City of Truro survives today. In May 1904, whilst working an ocean mails train from Plymouth to London, this locomotive is reputed to have reached a speed of 102.3 miles per hour. Was this the first time a locomotive reached 100 miles per hour? Whilst a high-speed run into the 90s is not disputed, it seems unlikely on balance that the magical 100 miles per hour was breached on this occasion. In any event, worried that passengers would be frightened away from its trains, the GWR threw a cloak of secrecy around the event. Not until 1922 was City of Truro's high-speed run officially acknowledged. Withdrawn in 1931 and preserved, City of Truro returned to work for the GWR's 150th anniversary in 1985. Churchward is best known, however, for his development of the 460, although Britain's first engine of this type had been designed by David Jones in 1894 for the Highland Railway. Number 103, painted in the Highland Railway's yellow ochre livery, is preserved in the Glasgow Museum of Transport. Churchward built his first 460 in 1902, but he was a cautious engineer and built some 442s of his own for comparison with French-built compound locomotives. However, he eventually decided to combine 6 coupled driving wheels for maximum traction with 4-cylinder drive to achieve smooth running. In 1907, the result was the Star class, sole survivor of which is Lodestar at the GWR Museum, Swindon. No other British Express engines of the early 20th century could run as hard or as fast with heavy passenger trains. By 1914, there were 61 examples at work, and they enabled the GWR to fulfill its First World War duties with distinction. The last examples worked in the 1950s. In 1913, the Great Central Railway introduced its Director Class 440s. This railway had previously used larger Atlantics, but it now found it could do the same job with smaller locomotives, largely as a result of more sophisticated boilers. Number 506, Butler Henderson, is the sole survivor of this class.
During the First World War, the railways had been placed under government control, and following the peace of 1918, it became increasingly clear that a return to the old ways was impossible. A proposal by the Ministry of Transport to nationalise the railways came to nothing, and government control ended in August 1921. On January the 1st, 1923, the 120 independent companies were grouped into 4 large private concerns: the London, Midland and Scottish Railway, the Great Western Railway, the London and North Eastern Railway, and the Southern Railway. This grouping created huge companies, and in 1923, the mighty LMS was the biggest undertaking of its type in the world.
But it was the Great Western which led the way with new express locomotives. In August 1923, the Castle class was introduced, one of the world's most famous locomotives. They were enormously successful. In 1932, Tregenna Castle achieved a record run from Swindon to Paddington with the Cheltenham Flyer, covering the 77 miles at an average speed of 81 miles per hour. On the LNER, Gresley's impressive Pacifics, such as Flying Scotsman, were in charge in the 1920s. They were glamorous locomotives which attracted much attention. Others were less fortunate, and the Southern Railway in particular suffered from a very poor public image. Aware of the GWR's success in courting public opinion, the Southern decided to try and create some mystique of its own. In 1925, this class was introduced, and all 74 examples were given names associated with the legend of King Arthur. This is sole survivor Sir Lemuel, leaving London's Marylebone Station. The King Arthurs were classic locomotives, performing capably both in the west of England and also on the heavy boat train services between London Victoria and the Channel coast. However, when the Southern Railway announced plans to run 500-ton expresses at an average speed of 55 miles per hour, it was clear that new, more powerful locomotives would be needed. This was the result. Lord Nelson emerged from Eastleigh Works near Southampton in August 1926. It was the first of 16 similar engines named after famous English naval commanders. They required careful handling to get the best results, but the Lord Nelson class was certainly capable of hard work and remained in charge of the Southern's heaviest expresses for the next 16 years. Lord Nelson is owned by the National Railway Museum. In theory, the Lord Nelsons were the most powerful express locomotives in the country in 1926, a fact which the Great Western Railway found thoroughly unpalatable. The Southern, which by this time had appointed former journalist John Elliott as Britain's first public relations officer, lost no time in publicising their new locomotive. There was consternation at Paddington, for the GWR did not like being played at its own game. Determined to regain the initiative, GWR General Manager Sir Felix Pole ordered Chief Mechanical Engineer Charles Collett to regain the laurels. This locomotive, number 6000, King George V, was built as the first of a new class, but its story was not straightforward. In 1926, Collett told Pole that the castles had been built to the limit of the 20-ton axle load imposed by the GWR's bridge engineers. Bigger locomotives were simply out of the question. Pole was furious. Next to be summoned was the company's chief civil engineer, J.C. Lloyd. He admitted, perhaps with a degree of discomfort, that for the past 22 years, all new bridges on the main line to the west had actually been built to permit an increased axle limit of 22 tons. However, content with the extra margins this created, the civil engineers had simply not bothered to tell either the general manager or the chief mechanical engineer. Furthermore, Pole learned that only 4 bridges needed to be upgraded to bring the whole Western Main Line up to the new standard. Suddenly, a new, larger locomotive was within the company's grasp. Pole told Lloyd to have the remaining 4 bridges upgraded immediately and instructed Collett to have a new engine, more powerful than the Southern's Lord Nelson class, ready for the summer service of 1927. An early plan to name the new class of 30 engines after English cathedrals was dropped in favour of English monarchs, and the Regal King was unveiled in late June 1927. The class was highly successful. For the first time, the Cornish Riviera Express could be hauled over the arduous South Devon banks by a single locomotive. The Kings ran hard and fast, with 500-ton trains, maintaining speeds of more than 70 miles per hour for miles on end. They were complete masters of express services for more than 30 years. This is Scott's Guardsman, one of the famous Royal Scot class, introduced by the LMS in 1927. In 1926, a borrowed GWR Castle had performed so impressively over LMS metals that tentative inquiries had been made about either buying 50 castles from Swindon or borrowing a set of drawings. The LMS was desperately short of express power. The GWR declined, but the Southern Railway was more helpful, and a set of Lord Nelson drawings was sent to Crewe. The LMS produced a design suitable for its own requirements, and the Royal Scots were born. The class was subsequently rebuilt by the LMS in this style, with taper boilers and more modern tenders. Despite the apparent supremacy of large locomotives, the 440 made a surprise comeback in 1930 with the Southern Railway's Schools class, designed by Richard Maunsell. This is Stowe at work on the Bluebell Railway in Sussex. The most powerful 440s ever built, these engines were all named after famous schools. Fast, reliable and popular with their crews, they worked until the early 1960s. In the 1930s, the prestige operations of the mainline railway companies reached a glorious zenith, spurred to greater achievement by their pride in the job and the challenge of competition, and assisted by superb locomotives, rolling stock, track work and signalling. Dedicated railwaymen created an express service in which speed, timekeeping, safety and punctuality reached new heights. With its Cheltenham Flyer, the GWR was operating the fastest train in the world in the early 1930s, whilst on the LNER, Sir Nigel Gresley's Pacifics were also running very fast indeed. On the LMS, a new regime commenced on January the 1st, 1932, when William A. Stanier arrived as Chief Mechanical Engineer. His first express engine was the Princess Royal class Pacific. This surviving example of that pioneer class is Princess Elizabeth, seen in the pouring rain so commonly found in the High Pennines, climbing the last few yards to Aysgill Summit on the line from Carlisle to Settle. Unveiled in June 1933, the Princess Royal class established the Stanier look. The family resemblance was clearly apparent in his next express offering, the Jubilee 460, introduced in May 1934. By 1936, 191 examples were in service, and within 2 years they were all named, some in honour of the countries of the British Empire, whilst others recalled famous admirals and their ships and battles, pioneer locomotives of the early days, even the counties of Ireland. Collepur is now owned by the Birmingham Railway Museum. Running a locomotive like this on the main line today is an expensive business. The examinations and repairs which BR insist must be carried out every 7 years can cost around £50,000. Back in 1934, the first batch of 50 Jubilees cost the LMS just £5,720 each. This is probably the most famous steam locomotive in the world, Flying Scotsman, designed by Nigel Gresley and built in 1923. This was the first locomotive to be completed by the LNER following the grouping. It was one of a class of 78 named after classic racehorses. And whilst experienced punters would doubtless have appreciated the gesture, others must have been mystified indeed to find their train hauled by engines named Salmon Trout, Blink Bonnie or Pretty Polly. Number 4472 made history on May the 1st, 1928, when it hauled the first non-stop Flying Scotsman Express between King's Cross and Edinburgh, a distance of more than 390 miles. In 1934, Flying Scotsman was in the news again as the first locomotive to be accurately recorded running at 100 miles per hour. Withdrawn from service in January 1963, Flying Scotsman was bought by businessman Alan Pegler, who restored the apple green livery of the LNER. The locomotive has since visited many parts of the country and is maintained in working order by its current owner, construction company chief W.H. McAlpine. In the mid-1930s, streamlining was very popular, and in Germany, a streamlined diesel train known as the Flying Hamburger was attracting much attention. High-speed rail travel around the world was causing much excitement, and in 1935, Pioneer A4 Pacific Silver Link emerged from Doncaster Works. The LNER believed that it could provide its own steam-hauled express service fueled by British coal rather than expensive imported oil. The sleek locomotive was an immediate success. On its first run in September 1935, it established a new world speed record of 112 miles per hour. Mallard became the fastest steam locomotive in the world on July the 3rd, 1938, when it reached 126 miles per hour, a record which remains unbroken. the A4s were a triumph for their designer, Sir Nigel Gresley, and it is appropriate that number 4498, preserved in working order, should bear his name. The 1930s was a golden age for Britain's railways. The LNER and the LMS competed with spirit for passenger traffic, newspaper headlines, prestige and speed records. By 1936, the LNER's high-speed exploits had brought into very sharp focus the need for a new and more powerful LMS Express class. The Princess Royal design was improved, enlarged and streamlined to produce Stanier's best-known and best-loved class, the Princess Coronations, or Duchesses, as they were more affectionately known by their admirers. They had an air of majesty, with or without their streamlined casings. The first engine, number 6220, Coronation, emerged from Crewe Works in May 1937. The power of these locomotives was limited chiefly by the ability of the firemen to keep the 50 square feet of fire grate supplied with coal. The class of 38 locomotives remained in charge of Anglo-Scottish express services until withdrawal in 1964. In the late 1930s, Britain's railways were at their peak. GWR, Collett's Castles and Kings continued to perform to perfection, and speed was very much the order of the day. Newspapers and newsreels took a keen interest, and the express driver was highly esteemed. In these years, the private car was only for the well-to-do, and long-distance travel was nearly always by train, for business or pleasure. Holidays by the sea always involved an exciting journey by train. On the Southern Railway, the Lord Nelson and King Arthur classes were in charge, and in other circumstances, the stage would have been set for a glittering phase of locomotive development. Sadly, this was not to be. On the morning of September the 3rd, 1939, a radio broadcast from London announced that Britain was once again at war with Germany. Rather surprisingly, a new Southern Railway Express locomotive appeared in March 1941, when the danger to Britain was at its greatest. The Merchant Navy class, designed by Oliver Bulleid. It was quite revolutionary, as were the similar but lighter Pacifics, which followed in 1945. The Pacifics had flat-sided casings, which Bulleid described as air smooth, and designed to allow them to pass through mechanized washing plants. The boilers and fireboxes made good use of inferior coal, and the chain-driven valve gear was enclosed in an oil bath in an attempt to minimize servicing and maintenance work. Whilst the Bulleid engines were powerful, popular with passengers and crews, and very fast, there were also serious problems. They had a voracious appetite for coal, and the novel chain-driven valve gear caused major headaches. From 1955, all 30 merchant navies were rebuilt in this style. Conventional valve gear was fitted, the troublesome oil bath was scrapped, and the air-smooth casings removed. 60 of the 110 light Pacifics were rebuilt in similar style. Many drivers preferred them in their original condition, but the operating costs of the rebuilt engines were much reduced. They served BR with style and distinction until the end of steam on the southern region in 1967. To their last days in everyday service, grimy and rather neglected, Bulleid's Pacifics were still running at speeds of up to 100 miles per hour, tribute enough to their capabilities. In the post-war years, the LNER produced a final new Pacific, the Class A2, represented today by number 60532 Blue Peter. But the impetus of the 1930s was gone, and time was running out for the Big Four.
Sadly, Bulleid's West Country class, like Tor Valley on our train, was one of the last express locomotive classes to be designed by the private companies. The war left the Big Four in a terrible state of disrepair, and there was no hope of catching up on the millions of pounds worth of deferred maintenance and investment. The railways were simply worn out. Nationalisation was at hand. At midnight on December the 31st, 1947, the Big Four passed into history, and the new British Railways organisation was born. It was a time of rumour and speculation. What was to happen now? Would the best engines of the old companies be perpetuated, or would new engines be built? Eventually it was announced that a new range of standard locomotives was to be designed for both goods and passenger services. The first was numbered 70,000 and was formally unveiled on January the 30th, 1951. It was named Britannia, as part of the new sense of national pride sweeping Britain in the early 1950s.
Like all the standards, the 55 Britannias built at Crewe were simple, robust locomotives intended to be easy and straightforward to operate and maintain. They did much fine work, but they never displaced the pre-nationalisation classes from their prestige duties. The last Britannia to survive in everyday service was Oliver Cromwell, which worked until 1968 and was then preserved. In 1954, this locomotive emerged, and it was meant to represent the culmination of more than 120 years of steam locomotive experience. Sadly, Duke of Gloucester never fully lived up to expectations. It could run very fast, but it also ran short of steam, especially when high power was needed. The problem could have been solved, but time was running out. In 1955, BR's modernisation plan foresaw the end of steam traction. Duke of Gloucester worked for just 8 years before being withdrawn in November 1962 and sent for scrap. Happily, the Duke was rescued, and 12 years of hard work by volunteers have transformed a rusting hulk into this pristine locomotive, which now represents the final phase of British Express steam traction.
Well, that's our journey through history almost complete. But the story of the steam engine in this country is far from over. Thanks to the dedicated support of the thousands of volunteers and full-time staff of our private railways and museums, steam locomotives will work on into the 21st century. Possibly the most famous, but certainly the fastest steam locomotive in the world, is Sir Nigel Gresley's A4 Pacific Mallard. This was returned to steam by the National Railway Museum in time for the 50th anniversary of its 126-mile-per-hour world record run of July the 3rd, 1938. The glorious days of the express steam locomotive live on.